We're set?
Yep.
Cool. All right, everyone, welcome to the debate. My name is Matt, and I'm joined by Zach, and we are the moderators for tonight. First, I want to tell you that we're at Ratio Christi, and it's a Christian apologetics ministry, and we're a club here on campus that gives good reasons and evidence to believe why God exists and why Christianity is true. So let's get started. So tonight we're having a student debate on, is morality objective or subjective? We have Will and Joel on the objective side, and we have Matt and Ethan taking subjective. And I will note that Matt and Ethan are co-creators of the YouTube channel Coherence, linked below. So the format of the debate is we're going to have opening statements, followed by responses, then a crossfire session, and then closing statements, and then at the end we will have an audience Q&A, which we will also be taking questions from the YouTube comments section. So be aware of that. All right, let's introduce our guests. All right. So our intent is to have a cordial debate, so please make sure that you're respectful of your opponents, our moderators, the host, the audience, and your debate partner. Being respectful includes not interrupting them. As far as time is concerned, you will have an allotment of time, but you do not have to use all of it. We will mention when time is up, and we will interrupt and cut you off after 30 seconds. All right, let's start with the objective side with opening statements. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you, Matt. The question we're debating tonight is this: is morality objective or subjective? We propose that there are good reasons to believe that objective moral values do in fact exist. But before we can make this case, I will define some terms and make a couple of distinctions. First, what do we mean by morality? Morality is fairly intuitive, so we don't need an extensive definition. But for our purposes, morality is what makes something good or bad, or right or wrong. For example, benevolence is good and hate is bad. We're arguing tonight that some moral values exist objectively. Beyond this, we make no claim about what specific moral values exist or to what or whom we are morally obligated. If we can merely show that some things are objectively good or bad, we will have succeeded in this debate. But what does it mean for something to be objective? It means that such a thing is not dependent on what people think or believe about it. For example, scientific facts are objective. The fact that the Earth revolves around the sun is objectively true, regardless of whether anyone knows it to be true or believes it. Even if everyone believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, that would still be objectively false. In the same way, we think that some moral values are objective, that the truth of a moral claim does not depend on the person or the society making the moral claim. Even if tomorrow something were put into the water that made everyone on Earth think that rape was morally good, that would not mean that rape was morally good. It would still be objectively wrong. Right and wrong are independent of what people believe about morality, and that is what we mean by objective. However, when we defend objective morality, we're not defending absolute morality. Absolute morality means that there are some moral rules that apply in all situations regardless of the circumstances. We're not making this claim tonight. Morality may be absolute or not, but we are claiming that morality is objective. Not that there's a specific set of rules that apply in all circumstances, but rather that in each particular circumstance there is some objectively right or wrong thing to do. For example, we would not be claiming that it is always wrong to lie in every circumstance. For example, what about lying to the Nazis? What we are claiming, though, is that there are situations in which it is objectively wrong to lie. Lastly, with the question, is morality objective or subjective, we have to note the word is. When we say that morality is objective, we're making an ontological claim, that moral values do exist objectively in some way apart from human beings. That differs from an epistemological claim, which is how human beings know what is morally good or bad. We're claiming not that we know all moral truths or that our knowledge and perception of moral values is perfectly reliable. We are claiming that regardless of how we know what moral values are or how well we perceive them, they do exist objectively. So now that we have clarified the terms of this debate, I will present 3 lines of evidence that lead us to believe that moral values exist objectively. Although Will and I are theists, there are also many atheists who argue like we do that morality is objective. Our first argument, in fact, for objective morality comes from David Enoch, who wrote a book published by Oxford University Press called Taking Morality Seriously, in which he defends objective morality from an atheistic position. First, our intuition and experience suggest that a rational person should treat moral disagreements differently than disagreements about personal preferences. Enoch presents this thought experiment. Imagine a scenario where you and a friend are going to go out to eat at a restaurant. You want to get Mexican food, but your friend really wants Chinese. You seem to have reached an impasse. You prefer Mexican, but your friend really does not. What would a rational person do in your situation? They'd probably offer some kind of impartial solution, like flipping a coin or eating at a neutral location, such as Italian. Would it ever be rational for you to stand your ground and insist that you need to eat Mexican, either your way or the highway? Now consider a second scenario in which you and your friend are partners on a bomb squad. You are both working together to disable an active bomb, but again, you reach a disagreement. You think you should cut the red wire to disable the bomb, but your friend strongly believes you should cut the blue wire. You have reached an impasse, so what should you, as a rational person, do? You have obviously come to a disagreement. Would it make sense for you to say, well, we should flip a coin? If heads, we cut the blue wire, but if tails, we cut the red one. Or say, like, since we can't agree, how about we cut the yellow wire instead? Or would it make more sense for a rational person to stand their ground and insist that they know the red wire is the one that must be cut in order to make it out alive? What is the difference between these two scenarios? Obviously, the restaurant one doesn't involve life or death, but there's more to it than that. The restaurant one is about mere preferences. In this case, a rationally inclined person would believe in the principle of impartiality, that each person's beliefs are entitled to equal treatment. What makes the second scenario different is that there is something outside each individual, namely a factual matter about which wire to cut, that causes us not to treat each person's beliefs equally. It is objectively the case that either the red wire or the blue wire will cause the bomb to be disabled, regardless of what you or your friend think. Now, consider a third scenario. Let's say your friend decides that he wants to shoot a puppy dog with a BB gun because he enjoys how the dog reacts to that. You observe his behavior and tell him that he shouldn't be doing that. He disagrees. You both believe the dog can feel pain, but your friend just doesn't think that matters. He can shoot the dog anyway. You've come to a disagreement again. What should you, a rational person, do? Would it make sense to say, well, let's flip a coin. If heads, then you stop shooting the dog, but if tails, then I won't ask you to stop. Or would you stand your ground and insist that your friend should not be shooting that dog? Which previous scenario is closer to this third one? The scenario about choosing a restaurant or about the bomb squad? Should a rational person in this moral disagreement treat both people's beliefs equally and act accordingly? Or is this moral situation closer to the one about the objective fact of which wire should be cut? We propose tonight that it is the second option, that moral disagreements are closer to disagreements over objective facts than over subjective preferences. Second, our moral experience strongly suggests that objective moral values exist. They just seem obvious or self-evident to us. Take the three scenarios I just presented. Because of our moral experience, we have strong reason to believe that objective moral values exist unless we are given at least an equally strong objection to doubt that experience. For example, we think that rape and child abuse are not just socially unacceptable behavior, they're objectively wrong. We've all said things like, no, you can't do that, or you shouldn't say that. These things come so naturally to us because our moral experience tells us that there are things which are objectively wrong. Therefore, a moral skeptic would need to provide some powerful evidence for us to doubt our moral experience. However, as Louise Antony, an atheist philosopher who defends objective morality, has said, any argument for moral skepticism will be based on premises which are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values themselves. Let's put it another way. How do we know that our five senses are giving us a reliable experience of an objective external universe? It seems obvious and intuitive that they do, but we can't prove it. It's possible I could be the infamous brain in a vat that is being stimulated to experience certain things, but none of it may actually be real. However, because it's so indispensable to our experience, we still find it rational to accept that our senses, on the whole, give us a reliable picture of an external objective of reality, even if our senses are not 100% reliable, like when I look at an optical illusion. Thus, the objective external universe would still exist even if my perception of it is not always reliable. Just as we rationally accept objective reality on the basis of experience, our belief in the existence of objective moral values is grounded in our moral experience. And since our moral experience is so powerful, an objection to it would have to be incredibly powerful to overcome the evidence of that experience. Just like our sense experience is so powerful that an objection causing me to doubt my belief in the external world would have to be incredibly powerful to reject the experience of my senses. Unless overwhelming evidence exists to the contrary, we would be rational in rejecting the idea that there is no objective physical universe, just as we are rational in rejecting the idea that there is no objective morality. Third, and finally, consider the moral experience of all humanity. C.S. Lewis, in The Abolition of Man, documents many common features of moral discourse across many different cultures throughout human history. He makes the case that while there are some moral disagreements, there are general moral principles that are broadly agreed upon. For example, that honesty is good. He gives examples of moral agreement from a wide variety of sources such as the Bible, the Quran, the Annals of Confucius, some Hindu, Buddhist, and Egyptian writings, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, Norse writings, and so on. What best explains this broad agreement in basic moral values among humans of different cultures and different times? Is this better explained on the theory that morality is merely subjective, that our intuitions of objective right and wrong are just illusions that can vary widely from person to person and culture to culture? Or is the evidence of broad moral agreement among cultures better explained on the theory that objective moral values, independent of any human being or culture, do in fact exist? Tonight, we believe the evidence is best explained by objective moral values. I will now pass it to Will to talk about subjectivism.
Thanks, Joel. So what I've done tonight is prepare some objections for the subjectivist position. I'd like to point out that the question of morality really only has two answers. It's either subjective or objective. There's not a third option or an in-between option. Similarly to the point Joel made, we're not arguing that all aspects of morality are objective, only that there are at least some objective moral truths. For example, that rape is objectively wrong. If subjectivism is true, then there is no objective moral standard by which any action can be measured. So as Joel pointed out, it boils down to preference. Under subjectivism, you could not make the claim that something is wrong, just that you personally don't like it, even though someone else may. This makes it so that morality only becomes a matter of opinion. So under this way of thinking, is there really any merit to having moral discussions? If there is no objectively right answer, then who's to say what is right or wrong? How can we ever make decisions as a society if we can't discuss moral truths and try to seek the correct answer? It seems that under a subjectivist point of view, we have no duty or reason to act upon any moral issues we may see in the world. Furthermore, we are not obligated to follow any moral laws. All moral answers and opinions would be equally true under subjectivism, so we can only say what we prefer. And I would assert that it would be inconsistent for someone who believes morality is subjective to argue that something is morally right or wrong, and it is hard to live in such a way where you cannot make such moral claims. This prevents us from condemning evil actions or making any kind of moral progress in society. It follows then that if subjectivism is true, we cannot say that slavery was wrong. It was just the preferences of the society at that point which served their purposes, and now society has changed where that is no longer socially acceptable. However, I believe it is more plausible to believe that slavery was objectively wrong. But if someone affirms morality is subjective, they can't say that slavery was objectively wrong, only that they themselves don't prefer it. All this to say, under a subjectivist point of view, we cannot make true objective moral claims, as we would have no way to verify these claims, because morality would be reduced to mere preferences. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, objective side, and we will now be giving 12 minutes to the subjective side to make their opening arguments. You may begin.
Good evening. Good evening. I'd like to first extend my gratitude toward Ratio Christie for hosting this debate. To provide a clear roadmap for what you might expect through the initial portion of this discussion, first I will be addressing Is it blue? Is there a blue light? I got turned off. There we go.
We just begin again.
Yes, you may.
Okay.
Restart the time there.
You're fine.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Good?
Good evening. I'd like to first extend my gratitude toward Ratio Christie for hosting this debate. To provide a clear roadmap for what you might expect through the initial portion of this discussion, first, I will be demonstrating why objective morality is actually impossible. Next, Ethan will describe why our ethical subjectivism, rather than realism, provides a more compelling account of reality. First, let's better understand what moral objectivism entails. The objectivist posits that both moral values and moral duties exist objectively, or independent of the human mind. In other words, all actions inherently belong to one of three categories: good, neutral, or bad. For example, the Christian might argue that praising God is morally good, flipping a light on is morally neutral, and stealing is morally bad, independent of how humans feel about these particular actions. However, it is worth noting that it is not necessary for our feelings about these actions to line up with the objective moral fact. For example, if objective morality can exist, then in some possible world, it may be the case that stealing belongs to the category of morally good, Flipping the light on is morally bad, and praising God is morally neutral. My focus tonight is not on objective moral values, however, but rather on moral duties, which are basically just moral obligations one has to a certain action. In other words, these objective duties are basically just ought statements. For example, when God posits, "Thou shalt not kill," it can be understood to mean, "You ought not kill." The problem with this is objective duties simply cannot exist. To support this claim, I appeal to the philosophy of David Hume, who rightly pointed out the unbridgeable gap between descriptive and prescriptive claims. To elucidate, I'm willing, for the sake of this argument, to grant that God exists and classifies certain actions as right or wrong, good or bad. Notice that this says nothing about what we ought to do with this information. Realists maintain that if good and bad exist, then we ought to do what is good and ought not do what is bad. I'm here to ask a very simple question. Why? Why ought we do what is good? And why ought we not do what is bad? Because God commands it? Well, why ought we do what God commands? Eventually, if we played this game long enough, we would assuredly land upon the grace of heaven and the suffering of hell as reasons for doing or not doing what God commands. In other words, we ought to do what is good because we will go to heaven, and ought not do what is bad because we will go to hell. Setting aside the troubling fact that this makes Christianity little more than a religion of carrots and sticks, it fails to ground an objective ought. And actually, this further demonstrates that all oughts are subjective. Although the choice may seem obvious to everyone here, it is nonetheless up to the subject to decide whether they wish to attend heaven or attend hell, thus rendering the entire system subjective. In other words, people must decide whether they wish to go to heaven or they wish to go to hell. If I were to tell you that I wish to go to hell, how do you convince me out of this proposition? By appealing to the suffering of hell? Again, that would just be demonstrating a desire to avoid suffering, which, of course, is subjective. This may be a troubling revelation, but objective duties simply cannot exist. Attempts at grounding such duties either result in an infinite regress or a subjective decision, neither of which supports moral realism. So then, does ethical subjectivism fare better under Hume's guillotine? Indeed it does. But before I can describe why the is-ought problem poses no issue for ethical subjectivism, let's first define our terms. When we discuss ethical subjectivism, we simply are referring to the view that moral claims are actually expressions of statements of one's desires. Thus, the statement, "murder is bad," can be understood as, "I have a desire against murder." And this actually makes a lot of sense. When someone tells you that Brussels sprouts taste bad, do you honestly believe that Brussels sprouts belong to the objective category of bad? Of course not. We can easily understand they simply mean that they dislike Brussels sprouts. When starting from a subjective desire, the roadblock posed by Hume's law disappears entirely, as we can easily frame the statement within a Kantian hypothetical imperative. This simply means that each prescriptive statement is really framed as an if X, then do Y. In other words, we can derive an objectively true prescriptive claim from a subjective desire. Let's go back to Brussels sprouts and see how this would work. The hypothetical imperative simply takes the desire of I dislike Brussels sprouts and frames it as, if I dislike Brussels sprouts, then I ought not eat Brussels sprouts to achieve this desire. As you will see, Hume's law no longer applies here, as it's not deriving an ought claim from an is claim, but it is deriving an ought claim from the hypothetical if. In other words, subjective morality easily overcomes an impassable barrier for objective morality. Now that we have established why objective morality is impossible, a description of subjective morality, and how subjective morality can overcome Hume's guillotine, I would like to turn the conversation over to Ethan to discuss other reasons why ethical subjectivism is a more compelling theory.
At first glance, moral realism is more intuitive and appealing than ethical subjectivism. In fact, I used to be an objectivist like you, and I will admit I find moral inclinations to be persuasive. Plus, objective morals are a nice thought. Being able to classify others' distasteful actions as objectively evil seems so intuitive. Unfortunately for the objectivists, neither wishful thinking nor mere intuition are enough to believe something is true. Furthermore, any real analysis beyond just a cursory glance shows two things. Firstly, as Matthew discussed, moral objectivism simply does not work. And secondly, moral subjectivism is actually far more compelling. The thing needing addressing is whether subjective morality provides a viable moral foundation. The biggest obstacle in front of us is ensuring subjective morality is still applicable prescriptively. Self-prescribed behavior is still clearly viable, as you are accountable to your own opinions. Even if subjective morality were to be oversimplified to just an opinion, you obviously have good reason to follow your own inclinations. This means subjective morality can explain internal feelings of right and wrong that are self-directed. To reiterate, when I say X is wrong, I could be understood to be expressing the claim I dislike X. I would follow a prescription X as doing so is in my interest. Further, outward prescriptions towards others are still viable and persuasive within moral anti-realism, or ethical subjectivism, due to the simple fact that there is a great deal of convergence within the moral principles of those who live within the same society. Some great examples of universally held beliefs are the beliefs that cooperation is better than defection and isolation, or the belief that pain and suffering should be reduced as much as possible. Because everyone holds some foundational moral beliefs, persuasion is always possible in virtue of appealing to some shared, common, and subjective moral position. If you can convince a person that their action is wrong in virtue of their own foundational moral beliefs, you can convince them to adopt the behavior that is in line with both your own and their moral beliefs. In other words, imagine someone who holds the value of murder being wrong and yet still supports abortion or is pro-choice. If you could convince this person to extend their definition of murder to cover fetuses, this would of course change their view on abortion. Notice that abortion need not be objectively wrong in order to appeal and persuade in accordance to some subjective value that the person holds. Let's move on to the next point, which is the existence of moral disagreements as positive evidence for subjectivism. The objectivist must argue that moral disagreements exist because different people hold different beliefs of moral fact. In other words, realists posit that there is an objective moral truth, and when people disagree about what that truth is, only one side can be correct. This is a workable explanation for objectivists, although it does leave a few unanswered questions. For example, where do our moral intuitions come from? If our moral intuitions come from God, say, why do some people disagree about basic moral intuitions? For example, is stealing bread wrong if you'll use it to feed starving children? The objectivist must maintain that either this specific stealing is wrong or is not wrong. However, the existence of differing perspectives poses a problem. Why would God create people that can have different moral intuitions? Wouldn't it make more sense if objective moral laws did exist for our intuitions to line up with them? In other words, while moral disagreements cannot technically disprove realism, we can imagine many more possible worlds in which people share many more, if not all, moral intuitions. Now let's examine how subjectivism approaches moral disagreements. Excuse me. Earlier, we provided an oversimplified account of subjective claims as basically being opinions. Let's expand our understanding of subjectivism now, and in doing so, we'll realize that subjective claims are not mere opinions, but rather a complex culmination of evolutionarily instilled tendencies. First, let's establish that evolution can select for behaviors. While it's worth noting that no serious scientist would deny this premise, a real example of this process in action is appealing to the Russian silver fox experiments. In this study, Dmitry Konstantinovich Belayev bred silver foxes together to either get aggressive or domestic behavior. Belayev did this by breeding the most aggressive behaving foxes together and breeding the most passive and friendly foxes together. After many generations, the aggressive foxes became vicious or totally wild animals, whereas the friendly foxes basically became domesticated and exhibited behavior very similar to that of dogs. In other words, we have very good reason to believe that behavior is genetically influenced. If behavior is genetically influenced, and we have just demonstrated that it is, we have a possible explanation for moral tendencies. People are genetically predisposed towards certain types of behaviors over others. As humans evolved into a gradually more social species, we started interacting with others more often, and certain behaviors led to more beneficial interactions. In other words, those who interacted cooperatively succeeded by surviving and reproducing, whereas those who behaved in a hostile or isolated manner were cast out or killed, thus limiting their reproductive success. As humans grew smarter, we began to codify these behaviors into a system that we now know today as morality. So, what does this have to do with moral disagreements? Since we know that natural selection is ultimately environmentally dependent, it is understandable that differing environments might lead to differing moral tendencies, and thus over time, people might approach moral issues from slightly different starting points. In other words, the difference between those who may steal the bread versus those who may not steal the bread could be explained by having slightly different genetic moral compasses. To put it simply, unlike the objectivist view that moral disagreements are the result of incongruent observations of moral fact, the subjectivist understands that moral disagreements are the competition of two people's differing desires. So far, we have established a few key points, and I will conclude with this. Firstly, objective morality is impossible due to the is-ought distinction. Secondly, subjective morality overcomes this roadblock. And thirdly, classic objections to subjectivism, such as the mere opinion meme, ultimately fail. And finally, ethical subjectivism provides a far more compelling explanation for the existence of moral disagreements. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Matt and Ethan. We'll move on to our response time. And objective side, You have 8 minutes to provide a response as soon as we set the timer. And
May
you're set to
begin?
go.
All right. First, I would like to respond to Matt's critique. Microphone needs to be on. Very good. All right. So, first, I will respond to Matt's critique of objective morality. Matt talks more about moral duties instead of moral values. And though we do affirm that moral duties exist objectively, we do not necessarily need this to be true to succeed in showing that morality is objective. As long as moral values exist, we have shown that at least one component of morality is objective. But since moral duties were the main focus of the critique, I will address them. Matt claims that moral duties are impossible by appealing to Hume's no ought from an is rule. And I agree that it is difficult, if not impossible, to derive an ought from an is. As atheist philosopher Michael Humer, who believes in objective morality, notes, this is simply a special case of a rule that says you cannot conclude anything without related premises, which applies even to factual is statements. For example, I can't derive or conclude that something is red without ever mentioning the idea of red in any premises. It's the same with ought conclusions. I cannot prove a normative ought claim without starting from a normative premise. Thus, every explanation, is or ought alike, must have some explanatory stopping point that is of the same nature as the conclusion. This poses a problem only for someone who believes in naturalism, that the physical world is all that exists, because they can only start from descriptive is premises. So if oughts do exist, they must be derived from ises, which is hard if not impossible. Thus, on naturalism, the is-ought rule says that moral duties cannot exist at all. No one can be morally obligated to do anything. For example, you're not obligated to tell the truth in any situation unless you want to. However, the is-ought distinction doesn't pose a problem for us moral realists because we do not believe the physical world is all that exists. We believe that you can start from normative ought premises, since non-physical entities, like objective moral values, do exist. Since we are not limiting ourselves to the physical universe, and thus only descriptive statements, we don't have to derive our ought claims from is statements, and thus can avoid the is-ought problem. Matt said that subjectivism can actually escape Hume's is-ought problem, but we disagree. In fact, we could turn the is-ought problem back on our subjectivist friends. Matt says that we can derive an objectively true prescriptive claim from a subjective desire. If I have a desire for X, then to achieve this desire I ought to do Y. But I see no way that this can be objective. Since Matt cites Hume to say that we cannot derive an ought from an is to obtain moral duties, I think it's even more implausible that we could derive an ought from a subjective hypothetical is. If an actual is claim cannot generate an actual ought, then how can a subjective, merely hypothetical is generate an actual ought? It cannot. The statement, if I have a desire not to eat Brussels sprouts, then to achieve this desire I ought not eat Brussels sprouts, is not an ought at all, but merely an is statement cloaked in ought terminology. It is equivalent to saying, if I have a desire not to eat Brussels sprouts, the way to achieve this desire is that I don't eat Brussels sprouts. That doesn't imply that I have an obligation not to eat them, but simply that not eating them is factually the way to achieve my desire. However, eating Brussels sprouts is a mere preference, which we argued in our opening statement is not similar to a moral claim. It is even more problematic to imagine how this reasoning might apply to moral situations. For example, if my desire is to own slaves, then to achieve my desire, I ought to own slaves. If this reasoning truly produced an objective ought statement, that would be an absurd conclusion which cannot be avoided by their form of subjectivism. Finally, I would like to point out that when using Hume's is-ought rule, it was not argued for, but it was simply assumed. But how do we even know it is true? Because like the laws of logic, it itself cannot be proven. We only ascertain such a rule by our intuition or rational experience. It just seems to be so. This is very similar to one of the ways in which we claim that the existence of objective moral values can be ascertained by way of our moral experience and intuition. Lastly, to argue for objective morality, we do not necessarily have to appeal to God or theism. We do not claim that a motivation to go to heaven or to avoid hell makes anything objectively right or wrong. If Christianity is true, there are other reasons for obeying God. For example, that he loves us, that he's our creator, that he's the moral judge of all people, and so on. But the point is, objective moral values and duties are not based upon whatever motivations we may or may not have for them, whether God exists or not. In this debate, we're merely arguing that morality is objective and not subjective. However, when it comes to best explaining how morality can be objective, there are both theistic and atheistic theories. Atheistic theories have been offered by Cambridge philosopher G.E. Moore and other contemporary philosophers like Eric Wielenberg, David Enoch, Michael Humer, Rush Schaefer Landau, etc. Theistic theories have been argued for by Christian philosophers like Robert Adams and John Hare at Yale, Alasdair MacIntyre and Robert Oddie at Notre Dame, and others. Of course, we believe that the theistic explanation of objective morality is more plausible than the atheistic explanations, but that's not the focus of the debate. We can show that moral values do exist objectively without claiming that God is necessarily the source of them.
Thanks, Joel. So firstly, I would like to respond to what Ethan said about moral inclinations being persuasive, because I do agree with him quite a bit there. It seems very natural and intuitive for us for there to be objective morality, and being able to classify others' actions as wrong also seems intuitive. Ethan is right that this alone is not enough evidence to believe that objective morality is true. However, I do think that on top of other reasons to believe in objective morality, a strong case can be made for objective morality from this intuition or our experiences. Any argument for subjective morality would have to be more convincing and obvious than this base intuition that it seems that we all have for morality. And that seems like a very hard task to accomplish. I would, however, like to reiterate that this intuition alone is not enough to believe in objective morality, because we are not relying on mere intuition to tell us this, but intuition in the absence of a suitable defeater. This is not wishful thinking any more than trusting our senses to give us, trusting our five senses to give us a reliable picture of the world in the absence of any compelling reason to not trust these senses. I would now like to address the second point that Ethan made, which is that even though moral subjectivism does boil down to preference, and that I dislike X is all that we have to base our decisions off of, this is acceptable because there is a great deal of convergence within the moral principles of society. If it is wishful thinking to believe in objective moral values, then I would posit that it is no less wishful thinking to believe that subjective moral principles will converge. Furthermore, what about when this convergence produces undesirable results? Such as in 1800s America, when the majority of Americans believed that slavery was morally acceptable. A slave owner could use this logic and say, you see, slavery is the consensus belief in our nation, and I am going to convince you to adopt this behavior that is in line with my moral beliefs, i.e. owning slaves. Or what if I have a serial killer telling me that it is okay to kill others because it is his preference, or someone else telling me that it is not okay to kill others because it is their preference? Whose behavior should I adopt? This is what I believe to be the key issue with subjectivism. Ultimately, you have to lean on something to differentiate the right and wrong preference, such as what causes the least suffering or what is the most useful. And this just gets you closer and closer to moral realism. For Ethan's third point, as I understand it, he is saying that moral subjectivism is a much more compelling evidence for why we have moral disagreements. I will concede that evolution could be a possible explanation for these moral disagreements, but I would like to point out that this does not pose a problem for an objectivist point of view. There are many theories for objective morality that include evolution, so this is not a defeater of objectivism. I would like to further state that if what we get our moral intuition and disagreements from is evolution, then it would follow that this is where we get the rest of our intuitions, such as the intuition that we should trust our five senses. And this defeats all knowledge if we can no longer trust these intuitions. Under a completely naturalist point of view, which is what I believe Ethan is proposing here as a strong explanation for subjectivism, we lose our ability to have any kind of knowledge, not just moral knowledge. Furthermore, if Ethan's evolutionary theory of moral inclinations is correct, and that evolution selects for different moral behaviors, and that is why we see our disagreement, where do we go from there? Since Ethan has already admitted that our moral intuitions can be very contradictory, leading to moral disagreements, how do we decide which moral inclination is the one we should accept? If it is all a matter of preference, how do we differentiate? This is my main problem with subjectivism. It leads us nowhere and brings us to a standstill when it actually comes to making moral claims, because as subjectivism says, all you can do is try to convince others that they should accept your moral preferences as their own moral preferences simply because they are yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you, objective side. We'll now be entering the crossfire portion of the debate.
Oop, not yet.
yeah.
Response first.
Oh, sorry, excuse me. The subjective side also has 8 minutes to respond. I apologize for that error. So the subjective side may begin their 8-minute response now.
First, I'd like to commend the other side's framing of the debate. Recall that they started by saying, we're arguing tonight that some moral values exist objectively, but make no claims about what specific moral values exist, or to what or who we're morally obligated. If we can merely show that things are objectively good or bad, we will have succeeded in this debate. First, I'll note that this is a brilliant attempt at shifting the goalposts away from proving objective morality in its entirety to only having to argue for the weaker point, objective moral values. Now, I could point out that the question we agreed to debate today is morality objective or subjective, and not just, do objective moral values exist, and rest my case there. But, as you will see, our opponents immediately contradict their new framing of only arguing for descriptive moral values by consistently using prescriptive language to support their claims. In other words, despite our opponents suggesting that they would limit the conversation to descriptive values, our opponents consistently utilize prescriptive ought claims without justifying their ontological grounding. For example, when discussing the bomb hypothetical, they ask, what should you, a rational person, do? Or slightly further down, when discussing the puppy, hypothetical, they suggest you tell him he shouldn't be doing that. In fact, they use the word should 11 different times in that segment. The issue here, of course, is the word should is a prescriptive term. It is suggesting what one ought to do or ought not to. So let's examine the two contradictions more in depth. First, they claim they would make no specific moral claims, yet they claim that shooting the puppy is a moral issue. Second, despite originally saying they would make no claims about moral obligations, by using the word should, they are making an ungrounded normative claim. Not only is this a direct contradiction, this is where our opponent's argument starts to unravel. To remind everyone here, because of the is-ought distinction, known as Hume's law or Hume's guillotine, even if objective moral values exist, objective morality would still be false. Appealing to some form of objective ought claim that exists in the ether is not a satisfying response to this. Thus, by including any normative claims, our opponent's argument is swiftly decapitated by Hume's guillotine. To make this complex idea much clearer, in suggesting that an impartial actor should take any course of action, our opponents are committing the logical fallacy of begging the question. Simply, if the judge is truly impartial, she would choose no action. Even if you personally think the bombs going off are necessarily bad, by making any prescriptive claim about what the judge should do, you're letting your biases against bombs going off influence your decision. A truly impartial judge, definitionally, cannot take a side on whether the bomb should explode or not. Thus, not only does our opponent's argument fail to support objectivism, but if the judge actually acts, then the argument actually supports subjectivism, because in choosing any action, the judge must first subjectively accept the moral desire of wishing to defuse the bomb.
Take that. So, moving on, despite emphasizing the distinction between an ontological claim and an epistemological claim, as to ultimately conclude that objective morality can be thought to exist independently of any reasoning regarding how we know that objective morality exists, our opponent's opening statement is concerned chiefly with that latter portion, how we might reason that objective morality does exist. Going on to admit that they will not make any specific claims regarding the existence of specific objective moral properties, they contradict themselves in their first argument for the existence of objective morality. In the argument, not only do our opponents presuppose that shooting a puppy is objectively wrong, they foundationally assume that there are objective moral features to perceive independent of people, in spite of admitting they have no knowledge on which specific moral properties exist to be observed in the first place. That is to say, not only is it posed that shooting a puppy is objectively wrong, but firstly, that shooting a puppy must either have the property of being morally right or morally wrong. The only issue is they present no evidence to support this assertion. Next, let's discuss their second point and address the burden of proof. As our opponent stated, either moral objectivism is true or moral subjectivism is true. This suggests that this sort of debate is to be decided by competing positive evidence towards each theory. However, when making any positive claim, one always retains a burden of proof to support each positive empirical claim with evidence. As moral objectivism states that morality exists as an empirical property independent of any person, this is definitionally a positive empirical claim. As moral subjectivism is the only alternative position to moral objectivism, and moral subjectivism does not make the positive empirical claim that moral properties exist independently of people, and rather only states that moral properties do not exist independently of people, subjectivism is definitionally a negative contraposition to objectivism, meaning that subjectivism is to be assumed by default. That is to say subjective morality exists in reality is only the standard assumptive negative claim that there is no reason to believe objective morality exists. The last point I would like to make is that it seems our opponents fundamentally misunderstand what makes a belief justified. In our opponent's second main argument for the existence of objective morality, they state that moral experiences strongly suggest that objective morality exists. Why, though? They say this connection is self-evident and obvious, appealing to intuition as if it serves as actual empirical evidence. They seem to suggest that moral experiences can only exist if morality is objective. However, this claim is both unevidenced and flawed, and as we have already pointed out, evolution provides an excellent source for non-objective moral experiences. In summary, our opponents attempted to reduce their burden to only proving objective moral values, but even then actually supported these claims with impossible prescriptive statements. Further arguments our opponents presented did not support objective morality due to either committing the logical fallacy of begging the question or relying on baseless claims and appeals to intuition. Thus, in light of the arguments presented and the impossibility of objective odds, we suggest the only reasonable conclusion is to accept ethical subjectivism. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to the subjective side. This time we actually are moving to the crossfire section, and this will consist of 5-minute modules switching back and forth between sides. Each side will get 1 minute uninterrupted to ask a question to the other side, and then the remaining 4 minutes of the 5-minute module are free form, consisting of an answer from the other side and any follow-up or clarifying inquiries. At the conclusion of those 5 minutes, that module will end, and the next 5-minute module will start with the other side asking a question. And if the 5-minute module ends, we will be interrupting at that end to direct the start of the next 5-minute module. So the objective side gets the first chance to ask a question in the crossfire. So they may begin.
Okay, I think we want to focus a little bit on Hume's is-ought distinction. I was going to ask, how is it that you avoid Hume's is-ought problem and still retain any kind of objective oughts by pointing to subjective desires? I fail to understand that. Are you arguing that you can derive an independent ought from any one person's subjective desires? I mean, sure, we admit that it's objectively true that I may have such a desire, but that doesn't obligate me or anyone else to act accordingly. If I have a desire to own slaves, then ought I to own slaves? Is this actually a moral duty or just a description of my preferences? And if it only describes my preferences, then is this really an ought?
We don't claim to have objective oughts, firstly. You can say the rest.
Sure. I think that you're misunderstanding what we're claiming. We're claiming that the statement that we're making is an objective derivative. So the ought claim we're making is really an objective derivative of something that's true. So the same way that if you want to get from point A to point B, the quickest way to get there is a straight line. Our objective ought statements in Kahn's hypothetical imperative are simply illustrating the quickest way or the most effective way to get from point A to point B, right? So if I say, if I have a desire to go from point A to point B, then the quickest way is a straight line. I ought to go on the straight line, right? By the same notion, if I have a desire against eating Brussels sprouts and I wish to fulfill this desire, then I ought not eat Brussels sprouts. It's not an objective ought, it's known as an objective derivative. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. I guess I was getting more at, so there's no obligation then inherent in what you're proposing then. There's no like, I don't like to eat Brussels sprouts, then I am obligated not to eat them. It's just that that's just the best way not to do something undesirable as far as I'm concerned.
The way I understand it, you have good reason to do it because you want to do it.
Sure.
It's not that that's like a preferable, it's that that's the only thing that there is. We don't think that objective oughts are possible. So that's
Okay.
the only possible alternative.
So you're saying there's no objective, like there's no, you can't say there's no obligation to do anything, there's no, like in
No.
society, I have an obligation to tell the truth in a certain situation, that doesn't exist on your system.
Well, if you wish to fulfill your desires,
Right. So someone wishes to lie.
given that people tend to be accountable to their own desires, right? They want to
Yeah.
fulfill their own desires. People would want, let's say, to live in a society in which lying isn't permissible, and so they choose to live in a society in which lying isn't permissible, and that is an objective derivative. It objectively follows that if you want to live in this society, then lying would be contradictory to that desire.
Yeah, and I think we would agree that there's an objective kind of a factual claim there. I just don't see how that rises to the level of any kind of an ought or obligation. Like if I want to lie, right, if my desire is to lie in some circumstance or a lot or whatever, then I ought to lie then. I guess that's what the logic would come out to say.
Yes, that is correct.
That is my desire.
Correct.
Right, so there's kind of just this, there's really no desire, no like obligations of anybody is independently obligated to do anything. It's just that whatever somebody desires, that's what will guide their action, and that's kind of the end goal.
Sort of.
The end statement.
The obligation to do it is contingent upon your desire to do it. And we
Yeah.
argue that under what you propose, even if objective moral features did exist, if we were to grant that, you still cannot have an objective ought. The ought is always derivative of your subjective desires.
Sure. Well, maybe this is me just like misunderstanding, but how could you not get the same claim from so let's say that an objective moral truth does exist to best so you're saying that there'd be no reason to fulfill that objective moral truth because the way I see it, like you can do it the same way where it's like I have the desire not to eat Brussels sprouts. The best way to fulfill that is to not eat them. But like saying eating Brussels sprouts is objectively wrong. The best way to fulfill that would be not to eat them. But
Sure.
it
Well,
does both work the same way.
Yes, like, it can exist within moral objectivism.
Sure.
But that means that, well, it sort of can. It can exist if moral values are objective, but that means that your system is still subjective because you haven't given us the ought reason. You're categorizing things, like, you're saying, like, this action is yellow. Well, that doesn't really mean anything. You have to tell us what we ought to do with this action. And for a system to be objective, it has to give us the is statement, and it has to give us the ought statement. You're just giving us the is statement.
I wouldn't, I guess under our definition of objectivity, I wouldn't say that it necessarily needs
Look,
both.
Let me take the last 15 seconds if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so I think the way that I would say is that even if things do have some objective property of goodness or badness, you have to prove why you ought do what is good or why you ought not do what is bad, which is impossible. It's always it could be contingent upon a desire to do things that are good, but that's still a subjectively made choice. There is no objective reason to have the to ought to have the desire to ought to do what is good. But yeah.
That's time, and the subjective side can ask that question as soon as we set the timer.
Sort of, so we can continue our conversation here. What is the worst thing that will happen if we do not follow objective morality? In other words, if we do not do what is objectively good?
I guess I don't know if there's a worst thing, but we could always say like a lot of bad things will happen. Of course, I'm smuggling in a definition of good and bad there, but I mean things that I could give just kind of some examples. Maybe people might murder each other but with more frequency. People might rape each other, right? There might be slavery in more societies. More rampant lying, et cetera, et cetera. Things that they would consider wrong. I guess that those actions would be increased if we had no compelling reason to follow them.
Yeah, and I guess one other way I'd put it too is it seems that we treat each other on a basis that those things are objectively right or objectively wrong. So could you phrase the question one more time? Just say it again.
Yeah. What is the worst thing that would happen if you don't follow objective morality?
I think just a lot of like the structures that we have in place for society wouldn't really have any grounding anymore. We wouldn't. It would be hard to condemn someone's actions in like a court system maybe or in like a justice system. It seems like we rely on a lot of that. So it would like that. Yeah.
I guess
So,
to add a little bit, there'd be like no moral progress, no moral critique. You really couldn't tell somebody your actions are wrong, you shouldn't be doing that. You couldn't make moral progress in society. Society just changed. We had slavery at one time, now we don't. We used to have segregation in the South, now we don't. That's not really an improvement, it's just something different that we did. Yeah, there's no way to really measure that or judge that.
I guess, like, can you understand that it just seems like you just rattled off a whole bunch of things that you subjectively accept as things you don't like? So when you were listing all of the bad things that would happen in society, those are all things that you might, to us, it at least seems like you're saying, well, I dislike this, and so if we don't follow these moral rules, it's going to happen, what's going to happen are things we don't dislike. Well, that works just as well for subjective morality.
Sure, but what if we had someone who subjectively did want all those things to happen? How do we say, no, let's stick with us four, because I'm sure, we all agree, lying,
I can answer that.
things, but let's say this mysterious fifth person comes in, what do we say to them now?
We appeal to a common value. We appeal to the most foundational value. At the very basic level, universally, everyone's going to desire pleasure in some sort of sort. I'm not saying necessarily the most hedonistic sense. They desire some sort of self-fulfillment, and they desire to not experience pain. And this basically, being universally held, allows you to communicate with people. Maybe they're willing to compromise one of their desires, and so that you might compromise one of yours, so that you and both end up happier.
Sure, so could you view that as an objective thing that we want to hold to then? Because that sounds to me almost like you're like leaning to like this, this new idea of like,
pain and pleasure is kind of the objective measuring stick in that.
No, it's well, sorry. It's universally subjective, right? So, while it isn't, it cannot exist independently of people, right? Pain and pleasure can't exist if you don't have people to experience them. So it has to be in the realm of subjectivity, but it is universal. So we're able to appeal and we're able to use these objective derivatives, right? Which still make the system subjective, but allow us to generate common values and get moral persuasion.
Right, and I guess, I mean, you could always talk to somebody, well, I mean, you know, would you like it if I did this to you, or something like that, that causes you pain, causes me pain. I guess there's always the chance, and often in our world, this happens a lot, where people just don't see that or don't care. Well, you know, well, my group, I'm getting ahead, or I'm doing what I want to do, I don't really care if it causes you harm. You know, people who get involved in different moral scandals or different corporate scandals, you know, often have this, you know, not considering the harm of another person doesn't seem to prevent them from doing it because they think they can get ahead and get away with it. And so it really, they're not doing anything wrong, they're just disregarding somebody else's pain and pleasure, but they're still acting consistently with the subjectivist framework. They're not.
Let me respond. It's wrong in virtue of the derivative that they have some desire that is mutually exclusive to that. See, the difference is we have a way of reasoning with people. If we both want something and we're both doing different things, the subjectivist can argue and sort of barter with a person or compel them to do something because you can
Right.
argue that they are mistaken about one of the actions, that it's actually detrimental to the imperative that they have. But what objectivists essentially say is you who think something is morally right, or somebody who has full color vision, and you view people who see things or who are mistaken about the moral property of something as being colorblind and not perceiving the right color. So really you're just telling people they're factually wrong. We have a way of compelling people to do things, and that's why we think subjectivism provides more reason or a better system by which to prescribe behavior unto others and convince them.
And I would offer one quick rejoinder on that. Yes,
We can continue on that if you
we're
want.
appealing to a common value is what I would come back. There's some kind of common value or objective standard that you're saying we should all agree to, I think would be the.
Not that we
Not-
should, that we
right.
do, coincidentally. Yes.
We're not making prescriptive claims in this, right?
We're not saying, we're not saying that we ought to desire pleasure and to avoid pain. We're saying that it is the case that people do desire pleasure and wish to avoid pain.
Yeah. So let's say I don't care, but, okay.
We would deny that that's
That's
possible.
possible,
Yeah.
okay. Are we going next? Okay.
Yeah.
We might go on to the evolution question.
Yeah, sure, do you want me to read it out, or?
Yeah, we could. So, okay, go ahead. You wanna go ahead on the?
Yeah, sure. Oh, I haven't get to it. All right. So you say evolution can explain our moral tendencies, and that this may be reason to doubt that our moral experience indicates that objective morality exists. What limiting principle says that evolution should cause me to doubt my moral beliefs, but not doubt my other beliefs about the physical world, i.e. the belief that my senses are reliable? If the fact that my beliefs evolved through an unguided, haphazard physical process only aimed at survival should cause me to doubt my moral experience being indicative of objective truths, what makes me not also doubt that my experience of the physical world as being indicative of objective truths? Wouldn't appealing to evolution as the source of my mental faculties cause me to doubt all my beliefs, not just my moral ones?
Yeah, so this might be a little pedantic, but I have a slight issue with the way you're phrasing, or the way you're talking about evolution. So it sounded, at least to me, that you said evolution is both unguided but also aimed at survival. I don't see how it can be both of those things at the same time. Evolution is the process, right, in which genes that genes that are better at surviving in environments go on to reproduce, right? And so, in a sense, evolution isn't this unguided process, but it's this very determined process in which certain genes propagate. And sort of in this sense, we can justify how certain beliefs might come to exist through evolution. For example, if someone assumes that there's a tiger, and there's actually a tiger, right, they have an objectively true sense about the world, then they'll go on to survive because they'll run away from the tiger or they will hide. Whereas if they have wrong beliefs about the world, then they'll die and they won't reproduce. I guess we can start from there and see what you want to go on to.
Yeah, sure. I don't know where I would disagree with any of what you said.
I guess I would add a rejoinder that when you're talking about, I don't think survivability and relationship to having true beliefs is necessarily always correlated. I mean, you can always argue that it maybe is, but I can see a lot of situations where you can produce a hypothetical where there is some behavior that results that might not be based on objective perception of what's actually going on or correct beliefs, but it still produces survivable behavior. And I don't think evolution is necessarily tuned towards necessarily just always having correct beliefs. It's more tuned towards survivability and whatever will bring about that result. So, I mean, you could have some weird belief that, you know, you're actually seeing, you know, evolution could convince your eyes that you're seeing a unicorn instead of a tiger, and maybe you, I think that one of the examples is used is you wanna run toward it or instead of away from it, but that ends up, you know, in your survivability. I'm kind of playing at the example, but you could have beliefs that are not indicatively true of the situation and yet produce a survival value. I don't see a direct correlation between truth and survivability, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. The issue I have is, yes, technically that is correct, but also technically the world could have been created yesterday, right? We can't prove these things. So if we want to boil it down that far, I would consider myself a fictionalist. Ethan might be what you consider a fallibilist. However, based off of what is most reasonable to believe, if we decide that, well, or it doesn't even need to be reasonable, if it's necessary for us to believe that the world exists to operate in our everyday lives, that may be a properly basic belief that we can build our system off of. We would just reject that morality is a properly basic belief, because as you can see, we can create a perfectly solid moral system off of subjectivism that actually has more explanatory power.
Yeah, and I guess we would argue that morality is in that properly basic belief subset because we think there's kind of a way in which it is like I said, deliberatively indispensable, I guess is the buzzword I read a number of times, where, you know, we kind of are in this world, we're engaged in a deliberative project, we have to decide what to do, and as a subset of that, what is best to do or what is right to do, and so it kind of becomes necessary that we have these deliberations, and so it kind of becomes necessary and very a part of our everyday lives. It's hard to live without even making any kind of moral claims whatsoever.
I guess we would just sort of, I would just sort of ask how you know what is best objectively, and why do you think there's an objective nature to it? The way that I would explain why I think that objective morality isn't immediately obvious about the world and that we don't have good reason to believe it is in the way that we can test other things like gravity or the basic physical properties of things. Morality cannot be tested in this way. There's a massive amount of disagreement that isn't reflective of the amount of disagreement over other matters of objective fact, like gravity or the Earth being round or a million other things. But there's much more disagreement within the field of morality, which gives me much more reason to be skeptical and abductively reason that subjectivism is true.
All right, now onto the subjective side to ask another question, and the time for that begins now.
So you state in your first argument, you use the terminology, what should you, a rational person, do? My question for you is, why do you presuppose that there is a connection between rationality and objective thoughts when you say this? Or I guess a better way of putting this is, what do you think this connection between rationality and prescription, or what one ought to do, what do you think that is? And why, how do you know that?
Yeah, so I guess I would start out by saying we're kind of making a parallel argument, kind of continue on where we were going with the physical senses idea. You know, we kind of start out with a rational person would believe that what we are seeing at this table is actually in front of me, and it's the color white, right? And all you people are sitting here, and you all have minds. Nothing I can prove. Also, if I kind of just perceive and kind of take that what my senses tell me is true, and so I kind of take that as, okay, it's rational to hold that. I also have this very strong sense that objective moral values exist, that it's kind of indispensable to the way anybody can live their lives. It's kind of necessary, and so I hold that. With the how should anyone behave, that hypothetical was trying to get at which is this closer to, right? We have certain things where we treat preferences very differently, right? We have this, you know, if I prefer chocolate ice cream and you prefer vanilla ice cream, well then I'm not going to force you to eat chocolate ice cream. We all kind of have this thing that we intuit about that situation that we shouldn't be, I use the word should again there, but I'm saying that we have this intuition. What I'm saying, like, I have this intuition that objective moral values should exist. I should or should not do that, right? That we shouldn't be telling them, well, you have to eat chocolate because I like chocolate, right? When we get to, like, you know, an objective fact situation, you know, is this table the color white? and you said, no, I think it's purple, well, I would be like, no, it's white. I'm not gonna, sit here and kind of try to be like, well, okay, you believe that, I believe this, so, So we're saying that moral disagreements tend to have the same form and structure or be similar to those objective fact claims and how we treat them, how we tend to treat them than the subjective preference claim.
So if you believe that morality is as immediately observable in the world as to be comparable to observing the physical properties of a table, then how do you explain the massive disproportionate amount of disagreement of moral matters compared to the non-existent disagreement over the fact that tables exist?
Yeah, so I mean, some things might have more agreement or disagreement about them as it comes down to it. So yeah, I kind of used an obvious example, the table is white, and I don't think anybody would challenge that, but I mean, there's no...
Not that they're on the same level, yeah, that.
I did use the example, but I guess you could start saying, well, things that are maybe less intuitive, like, for example, if I have a pencil sitting in a cup of water, right? Well, is the pencil bent? Well, yeah, it looks bent, right? I'm seeing a bent pencil, but, somebody says, well, no, it's straight, right? Let's say we can't take it out of the water, so we have to disagree. Well, I think it looks bent, the pencil is bent. No, it's straight because the water's bending the light. We're disagreeing about a factual statement. There is actually an objective truth there, but the disagreement still exists over a lot of factual questions, right? There's a lot of, factual question, are the unborn human? It could be a factual question that generates a moral disagreement, but it's basically a factual analysis with regard to abortion, right? So there's a lot of ways I think that factual disagreement also presents itself just akin to how moral disagreement would, or even how we perceive things. Like, this looks like this to me. No, it looks like this to me. Or scientific theories, there's disagreement among scientists, So I think that there is factual disagreement. The hypothetical I used about the table being white is one where there's not a lot, but...
I don't want to derail the conversation too much either, but I'm understanding it as like, you're saying that morality isn't as obvious as some of these things that we're saying, that those things are so obvious that we just and necessary to adopt a similar belief on, that we just have to. But you're saying that due to like a model that you propose, that morality doesn't fall under, we can separate these intuitions from ones that we kind of have to live by, sight and touch and things like that.
So,
just to kind of clarify.
Yeah, to make my position clear, I think it's obvious that morality does not exist objectively in the way that tables do. The difference is pencils, whether the pencil is bent or not, can be empirically tested. You can observe that, and then you would agree upon, at least for the most part, upon the observations you're making. But morality can't be tested in this way. It doesn't, for people to disagree over morality, what property are you going to alter and test? I guess you can continue on that if you want. But to be clear, I was saying you stated that it's an obvious, immediate physical or property of the universe comparable to physical properties and things like that. And so I was asking you to explain a disparity between disagreements about physical properties and gravity and such, and the massive amount of disagreements about morality. I'll let you continue.
It's just, to close this, it's not so much that we're discussing the obviousness of of morality, but rather the observability, testability, and the evidence for believing it. And so we're able to observe our world, we're able to test things in our world, but we're not able to do that with morality.
All right, thank you. We will now have 5 minutes for the objective side, beginning now.
I'm going to offer just a bit of a response there, using up my time, obviously, but I think there are other things that we accept rationally that we really can't physically test. The fact that our senses do correspond to reality really is hard to test. It's just kind of something we start with as an assumption that we go with. It's hard to test rules of logical inference, or even the is-ought rule. We can't really test it and come to a conclusion. We can say, it seems true, and it seems true in most cases, but there's no real testability there. And then even like believing that you have a mind and you're a thinking person and not a robot is kind of an assumption I make about you metaphysically that seems rational to accept, but I can't really test that assumption beyond in a scientific manner. I think there's things that are not necessarily testable, but they are rationally acceptable.
If you want to continue on that, we can, just so you know.
Yeah, we could. I'm gonna go on a bit about disagreement, if that's okay, and then
No, that's fine.
I'll kind of tie this in. I said that you say the existence of moral disagreements is positive evidence for subjectivism, and so it kind of relates to this point, I think. But I was going to say, could you explain further how it is that moral disagreements lead us to doubt objective morality? For example, if I disagree about a matter of fact, not that the grass is green, our disagreement would not be evidence to conclude that there is no objective fact about the color of the grass. But many people disagree about, like climate change, whether it's real or whether it's man-made. The fact that people disagree doesn't mean that it's not happening, but there is an objective fact of the matter. But how does it that just mere disagreement about morality kind of indicates to you that it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah, so this is, it's an abductive argument, essentially, and this is kind of what I was saying before. So there are disagreements about matters of fact. These are testable things. I don't think that the amount of disagreements that you have in this sort of way is comparable to the amount of disagreements within the field of ethics. Additionally, to respond to further clarify the point that I was making before, what we were saying. So if it is intuitive that you are observing morality, that it is a matter of fact that you are observing it, I would ask you how often in your life you find yourself to make the wrong decision or retroactively decide that you had made a bad decision, and then compare that to the amount of times you sit down in a chair and don't actually sit in the chair, because that's the difference that I am trying to highlight. The amount of times you doubt whether what you did was the right or wrong decision versus the amount of times you look at a table and doubt whether the table is there.
Yeah, and I guess it's hard to make claims about, you know, the relative frequency of disagreements like that. I mean, I could also point to some of our, like our universality point was trying to say that there are some broad agreements or broad patterns, and I think even talked about like convergence of certain principles, which I think can also be detected. So there's a question of what, on an abductive argument, best explains convergence, or best explains people actually agreeing on moral claims. There's a second thing of like, you know, yeah, of course, about the table being there, I might not have a doubt that, oh, did I see a table tonight? Was I sitting at a table? But there's other factual claims, you know, in our situations, like I'm driving a car, and oh, did a red car just go by? Or, you know, other, you know, in a scientific experiment, oh, did we really see that happen, or did we not? You know, did I observe this on the meter, or was that just kind of a bit of noise? You know, there's times when we do have factual uncertainty. I don't think it
Yeah, but that
really
doesn't cause us to doubt then that the factual like thing is there or not.
And that's what I would say, is that, yeah, there's uncertainty in both realms, but in the factual case, certainly doesn't cause us to doubt that there actually is an objective fact to be known. And I would say in the moral case, it shouldn't necessarily cause us to doubt there is a moral fact to be known.
If you want to.
Sure.
I can say something, but I'll let you.
Well, we're bringing up like two issues, so I want to respond
Okay.
to the first one. When we're discussing moral convergence and moral disagreements, so moral agreements versus moral disagreements, this poses good evidence for subjectivism, and we can utilize like the a many possible worlds approach. So we can imagine more possible worlds in which there would be greater moral convergence if objective morality were true. For example, God might will that everyone experiences the same objective morality, whereas under subjectivism, especially through evolution, we observe the pattern we would precisely expect to see, right? So under evolution, you expect broad agreements, such as murder being generally bad, slavery being generally bad, but then you can get to more specific things in which there are disagreements, and this is what would be expected because evolution works broadly, but then would diverge in cultures. So cultures that punish stealing more harshly would have stronger moral urges against stealing.
Yeah, so I guess with the many possible worlds approach, you're kind of saying, well, but I'm running out of time here, there could be, I don't want to frame this, yeah, there could be many possible worlds where this is the case. I guess I could posit other possible worlds where our factual perception isn't as clear, or where it's clearer, like we never actually observe, you know, things that are inconsistent with our experience. So I guess I don't see how positing such a possibility really defeats anything.
Just
question is, it was your question or our question?
I think it was our question,
Yeah,
so
okay.
give it.
So we'll just take it. Again, I consider myself to be a fictionalist, and Ethan considers himself to be a fallibilist. So we recognize that there are potential flaws in perception. We just base our systems around that. And then we look for within these systems where we have a foundation that is potentially flawed. Going off of that, what makes the most sense? What beliefs based off of our foundational assumptions are most likely to be true? And we find that while assuming things such as this table being here is a assumption that is not necessarily true, it is one that we find that necessary to operate in our everyday lives. Whereas things like morality, we actually have very good reason to doubt based off of the observations we make.
Do you want to pose a question to us as part of this?
I
or-
was sort of formulating one. I wanted to
Okay.
sort of take things in a different direction.
Okay.
Instead of just ask you, I'd like to expand upon this a little bit, because this is part of the reason that I am so skeptical of morality existing as a property, an observable property of the universe. So what sort of features do you think that morality has as a property? Especially because morality as a property is only observable within the context of time, right? I just think that it's a very difficult thing to ponder. And then as a sort of follow-up, I'd like to ask you, if it is a matter of fact, and we have an objective ought to do what is good, then why do people do bad things?
I guess the way I would view like objective morality is similar to like an objective like maybe mathematical truth, to where it's not, observed. Does that make sense?
Directly observable, yeah, no,
Yeah, where it's not like,
logical principles.
yeah, where it's not like directly observable, but it's, yeah, in that way. I don't know. That's just what first came to mind when you said that. But
Like what kind of properties does it have? I guess it sounds like I don't want to speculate. I guess at the beginning we kind of said morality is just basically what makes something good or bad or right or wrong. So that could be kind of the property of a moral fact would be that, or just a distinctly moral property. I don't know if it's, I'm not trying to describe it physically, right? I mean, there's some systems that would hold that these brute moral facts are kind of this abstract object that exists out there, and they just are this fact, this ontological object in and of themselves. But no, I don't consider them to have any physical properties, just kind of like, modus ponens or some kind of a logical rule wouldn't have any kind of physical property. I wouldn't say what's the property of modus ponens, but it's something that I believe exists, right? It's something that I can infer and reasonably accept and use. The second part of your question was,
Yeah, so if people observe things
Oh, yeah.
as objectively right or wrong, someone notices that an act is objectively wrong, hypothetically, and
Yeah.
they understand it to be objectively wrong.
yeah.
Why do they fail to not do the thing?
Yeah, I think that boils down to two things. I mean, I think that free will might play in here, but just the fact that there are desires and they can run in kind of contrary directions sometimes, and they can even.
Well, I would sort of interject, isn't the point of objective goodness that you are compelled to do good, that you feel a desire to do good? So if people are observing it, doesn't it directly follow that they would have this desire, this compelling to do the objective good thing?
I would say other desires could trump that desire. Like, a desire to make the selfish decision that would, benefit you more. Often, in my life, almost every day, like I do things that I know aren't probably objectively the right thing to do, but I had these other desires that.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of complex desires, some of them contradictory, and I think that the question is, well, what is the best desire? What should I do? Moral subjectivism, I have no way to really differentiate. My desires are going to control what I do, right? I don't have any way to say, well, I feel like I should do this, but maybe I shouldn't do that, and what should I do? Nothing helps me make that decision on a subjectivist point of view, and we would say that, the fact that we, don't have perfect moral knowledge, like we're arguing, that there are a lot of desires that we are subject to, maybe evolutionary, maybe not, that can basically mean that we don't always do what we think is objectively right? There's just not, I don't think it follows that because we have obligations that we're always going to keep them, or they would kind of be meaningless, right? Hopefully they would be controlling more often than not, but there's no guarantee that there will be this correlation between what we actually end up doing and the fact that we are obligated to do it, right?
It seems like you're distancing yourself, and again, you're describing the fact that there is some descriptive property of goodness, but you are now like shying away from the compelling of the doing of the objectively good thing. This is the main problem that we had. Did I state that clearly?
I think so.
I guess I'd make a comment that we're compelling in the sense that we're not saying that because we have an obligation, we're not being forced to do it by some higher power or something, but.
It seems to me that you're saying that people don't have good reason to do what is good, and therefore sometimes they do things that are more selfish than the good thing. If they chose to do the selfish thing because it was more rational to them, or they had more reasons to do it, does it not seem like they don't have good reason to do the good thing?
No, I mean, there could be, good reasons. I mean, that's, again, I guess in your system, that'd be a completely subjective thing. Good reasons just mean it's something I desire, right? On our sense, it might not be a good reason. They might have a good reason to do something morally right. Thank you. Just start the next one rolling. They might have good reason to do something morally right, but that doesn't mean they have to always act in accordance with what is a good reason, right? We might, think that, I'm trying to think of an example off my head, but somebody might have a good reason for doing something and yet just not do it for whatever other reason. Might be an inferior reason. Maybe they just make a bad decision, right? But it's not that they don't have reasons or don't have something they should do on that front.
Is there a question?
This is our last one, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Where do you want to go with?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay. So, David Enoch proposes this kind of quasi-argument. It's a little bit involved, but I want to see kind of what you think might go wrong in it. He says, assume that subjectivism is true, that moral judgments can report simply preferences, ones that are on par with a preference for playing tennis rather than watching a movie. Subjectivism is true, then interpersonal conflicts due to moral disagreements are really just interpersonal conflicts due to differences in mere preferences. When an interpersonal conflict is a matter of only preferences, then an impartial solution is called for, and it's wrong to stand one's ground. Therefore, in cases of interpersonal conflict due to moral disagreement, an impartial solution is called for, and it's wrong to just stand one's ground in moral disagreement. However, in cases of moral disagreement, often an impartial solution is not called for, and it is permissible or even required to stand one's ground. Thus, subjectivism is false. And our question would then be this, where do you think something like that would go wrong, or what part of that would you deny to affirm subjectivism?
Do you want to clarify specifically what part of that you want me to respond to? I feel like there's a decent bit there.
Yeah, it was kind of the idea is boiled down. Okay, if morality just boils down to preferences and desires and things like that, then there seems to be kind of this like, well, we can't judge, we can't have any kind of an evaluation of those desires. And if that is the case, then do you propose that all moral disagreements, there's no moral disagreement that actually is not subject to such a rule where we just cannot decide, and what are somebody's desires?
Yeah, I would respond that that thinking that we can't be partial is you are implicitly suggesting a prescriptive thing. We ought not to be partial.
Yeah.
But in fact, there is no reason to not be partial.
Right.
So I don't think that's a good response at all. I think that this idea that something being on some sort of intricate, complicated, internal list of desires and their rankings, and they fluctuate and they change, to that just being a mere preference, I think that's a bit of a reduction. And the idea that because my desire is just as legitimate as in yours, in the sense that there is no reason to see either of ours as better than the other, that doesn't give us any reason to not try to use our desires or our reasoning to influence another person's desires. I fail to see that.
What would be our motivation for even wanting to do that, though? Just because we want them to be in line with our desires because it makes us happier?
Well, people generally are happier when we work together, yeah.
Yeah, but what if somebody's not happy when we work together? Then their desire is to shun that, and that's okay with us, or?
Then they ought, under the condition that they would like to be alone, go be alone.
Yeah, and so then, with being alone, we kind of treat that as, again, that is a preferential choice in itself. Being with people, being alone, we kind of treat that as I'm not morally obligated to go hang out with people. Or
Yeah,
whatever
it doesn't encroach
But-
upon anyone else's, like me choosing to be alone. I don't think a ton of people would have any problem with that, but where I see a problem arising is when your preferences do directly, conflict with someone else's.
We
then-
take murder
then,
rate or
yeah.
something.
Yeah,
Right.
so again, our initial answer is to appeal to a universal or a foundational moral belief, find something that you agree upon, and then convince them that through their own working, through their own system, that they're not actually acting in their own best interest. If that fails, and we don't think there is a situation where rationally you wouldn't have some sort of foundational shared moral value, then you just enforce your own at the cost of theirs. If somebody can't be bothered to be worked with, then there's no reason for me to, again, not be partial. I have every reason to be partial to my own desires.
But just to add on to that, I think you already probably recognize that we do that. So this is what laws are, right? So if someone's desire really isn't in line, well, we can use laws to convince them that the desires are in line. So let's say someone desires to murder someone, but then doesn't desire to be in jail, right? They wouldn't commit the murder because their desire against going to jail would be greater than their desire to commit murder. And if someone does commit the murder, then we imprison them because our desires can supersede the individual's desires in a society.
To be clear here, you're saying that even if all of the moral statuses are internally just desires, there is still a hierarchy of desires within yourself. They're not all equal just
Right.
because they're desires. So if they desire to not go to prison more than they desire to murder someone, then it would only be rational for them to not murder someone.
Is this our last question?
Yes, this is
Okay.
the last question from the subjective side, and your time starts now.
So I just want to get back to the is-ought distinction because during your rebuttal you attempted to provide a response to it. I must admit I didn't find it particularly satisfactory. And I think this is because, so you suggested something along the lines of, well, it's possible that an ought statement exists outside of the material universe, outside of naturalism. And so I guess it's possible that there is a command that we ought to do something, but then I can just apply Hume's law to that command and say, well, why ought I follow this command? You've posed yourself into an infinite regress. And so I was wondering, like, why ought I follow commands? Why ought I follow ought commands that you're claiming are objective?
Yeah, and I guess I would appeal to a couple of things on that. First of all, when you start with kind of a base ought, I mean, I don't think it really falls to an infinite regress, because again, I'm not trying to derive an ought from an is. The fact that there is an ought, I've got my ought, and then I can derive any oughts from that I want to, right? You ought to love your neighbors yourself, therefore you ought not murder them, things like that. Murdering your neighbor is not loving, therefore, and construct a syllogism. I don't think that it's necessarily a matter of infinite regress, and I also think that at some point you're going to have an explanatory stopping point. There is just going to be some base assumption beyond which you're not going to be able to probe, and that kind of exists in a lot of systems. It's not just with that we have this random, ungrounded fact floating out there, and it's only true of morality. I think that pretty much anything, if you don't assume something and have some bedrock, at some point you're going to hit some kind of a stopping point. We just argue that that is the stopping point.
I would argue that you don't have to hit the stopping point.
Right.
There's no logical reason to reach the stopping point, and that's exactly why it's definitionally an infinite regress.
Right, but I think that reduces a lot of things to infinite regresses. So, for example, should I do science? I don't know. Or could I do science? Well, I don't know if what I'm observing is actually what the objective world is. So, if I can't make that assumption, then what says I should make that assumption? Well, I don't know, because it seems like it. But the explanatory stopping point is that I can trust my senses. That's a base belief, and I go from there. I think the whole idea of properly basic beliefs is from the fact that you can't get beyond them. They are properly basic. There's no explanation for them. There's no, kind of further back explanatory.
Because this is the last question, I would like to restate, why ought you do something that it is stated that you ought to do? Why ought you, actually, let me say it like this. Why ought you do something that is good?
Why ought you do something that's good?
Why ought you do what is
Right.
good? Yes.
So there's a few answers to that. So usually this gets on to explaining, how morality is objective, right? Why ought you to do what is good is kind of we would argue, secondary question to, okay, objective morality does exist. Okay, now why ought we to follow it, right? So we think that that's kind of a little bit to the side of the debate, but that's where you get into what is the grounding of morality, right? There's theistic and there's atheistic, proposals. On like a theistic proposal like ours, we could say, well, because God commands it, that's why you ought to do it. On an atheistic proposal, you could say
Can I
that-
jump in there? Can I ask you why ought you do what God commands?
Yes, you could. So let me back up a little bit. So then on an atheistic proposal, there might be a thing that, well, there are certain circumstances in view of a situation that instantiate your moral obligation. The moral obligation is just a brute ethical fact of the way the universe works, right? Or there is some kind of an abstract entity that does define the obligation, and it just is the stopping point. On the theistic side, like I said in the speech, there's numerous ways that, because God is the ultimate being, He is our creator, He loves us, you can kind of derive these facts about why we should do what God commands that are ultimately grounded in God Himself. And so God kind of becomes the stopping point for all of reality, not just moral claims, but the fact that the universe exists. And on a theistic system, I think that is plausible, and we think that's the best explanation. It's not required for us to have that explanation to have objective morality, in our view, but that is kind of the explanation for, how, and kind of delving a little bit deeper into the explanatory side of things, I guess, if you want our position. There are atheistic positions that try to answer this too, but.
I kind of think of it too, this will take like 10 seconds, objectively 2 + 2 = 4, and so we ought to use that truth when we do like math, because it works in a way. I don't know, that's my initial thought. I might have problems with it, but.
You're sort of using the hypothetical imperative there, right? You're saying if we want to be correct about math, then we ought to accept 2 + 2 = 4. That is definitionally subjective.
Okay.
Does that make math subjective?
No, it makes our desire to do math correctly is subjective. So
Okay.
it is objectively true that 2 + 2 = 4, but if we want to be correct about our equations,
Yeah.
then we have to accept that 2 + 2 = 4.
Yeah, and if I want to be correct about morality, then I will do what's right. Or if I
No,
wanna-
no, sorry, that's not that doesn't necessarily follow, because you're saying sorry, I shouldn't jump in.
He just made a
Yeah,
hypothetical.
I was thinking of it as an ought statement. Yeah, if you want to be correct about morality, but there's nothing telling us that we ought to be correct about morality.
Okay, thank you guys. We'll move on to closing statements, and we'll start with the objective side, with 8 minutes to do that.
Your time begins.
This will be a little bit disorganized because this is off the cuff. I was going to note that some of the language, I'm going to go back to the rebuttal statement because that was more kind of where I took notes throughout all of this, but some of the language about, okay, we say that we're not actually talking about what moral values exist or how we know them, but yet we kind of scatter throughout their different things about what we think about moral values, and I think that that's really because we're trying to use hypotheticals to get at what we actually believe, or we're not saying that when we state that, shooting public BB gun is wrong, in the context of this debate, I'm not making a statement, I'm putting this on the table as here is the objective morality that we are actually arguing for, this exact action. I'm using that as a hypothetical to try to compare how we treat moral disagreements versus how we treat factual and preferential disagreements. Let's see, did you have anything to add while I... Okay. I guess also we didn't admit that we had no moral knowledge when we say that we have it. We think that there is likely that we have moral knowledge. That's the whole reason with intuition, but we're not making this case that we know it perfectly, or we're not saying how we know that morality is true. We're saying that we know it. So I was going to comment a little bit on this subjectivism being assumed by default. I don't quite think that's accurate. I don't think that we should just assume something by default unless we have good evidence to believe that it's true. And so I don't know if the evidence for subjectivism is necessarily that powerful, and I would argue that because we have this intuition, this moral experience to give us powerful evidence for objective morality, if we can't find any kind of a defeater or a similarly strong objection, I don't really realize why we should default to a subjectivist position. I think maybe the default position might just be agnosticism. I don't know if morality is subjective or not. That might be the default position, not that it doesn't exist until you've proven it to me otherwise. Let's see, what do I want to respond to? So yeah, I think we responded to why obey God, and again, that's a question of, how is morality objective? But of course, an atheist like David Enoch, like Rushmore Landau, like Eric Wielenberg, all of them who argue for objective morality using atheistic theories, they don't think it's necessary to answer the question, why obey God, and neither do we, in order to know that objective morality does exist. I think William Lane Craig kind of uses a really good example where he says you can know, that there are objective moral facts without knowing that God made them or that God expects you to do them or that God put them there. Kind of like walking along a beach and you see a sign that says, no trespassing. You can kind of get into it the authority behind the claim and the fact that it's telling you to do or to not do something, regardless of whether you know that God put it there and whether knowing why you should obey whoever put it there and all of that. You kind of get the idea of the morality behind the claim. Again, that's just kind of a hypothetical for why I think it's plausible to say that we can perceive moral values without having to posit that God had to be behind them or having a fleshed out theory of why we have to obey God. Let's see, what else? Yeah, and I guess I would say about the moral desires, I'd say at the end there, we were talking about, on our last question, how do we differentiate between desires? And you kind of said that there's a hierarchy of desires or kind of some kind of a gradation, and I think that would, if we're going to even compare desires in this hierarchical or graded manner, there has to be some kind of objective measuring stick by which we are measuring them. I don't see how we could get around the fact that, yeah, we have these desires. If I can say this desire is better than that desire, that we're really going to have a true subjectivist position. It seems like at that point, if we can judge our desires, this desire is better than this desire, we're inching ourselves towards, if not already having adopted an objective standard of some sort that underlies them.
Yeah, to add on to that a little bit too, if you don't mind, I think at one point we made the distinction between, we're saying some things that we would say probably are objective, you would say they are universally subjective. I think we use that terminology at some point. And yeah, I think that kind of what Joel's saying there is that those two things are so close. And obviously there is difference there. But yeah, anyways.
Yeah, and I was going to say, kind of there's this, if I, we say, well, okay, yeah, my desire might conflict. I might want to murder somebody, but I don't want to go to jail. Well, then maybe I shouldn't murder them because I don't want to go to jail, and I let that desire override. But that's purely my personal preference. If I want to go to jail because I'm provided for, I don't have to work, and I still have meals and whatnot, then I can murder somebody. There's nothing that tells me it's wrong to murder in that case. I want to go to jail. I fully accept the consequences of murder. I don't think it's getting me the death penalty. Then I can murder somebody so that I can go to jail. In a subjective system where there's this hierarchy of desires, there just is no way to call that wrong or even inferior. It just is what I desire, and that's what I did. So I think I will move on to kind of a more of a formal closing statement, just to summarize a bit. During this debate, we believe that we have shown that most plausible explanation of our experience is that objective moral values exist. We've also argued that subjectivism is not a sufficient explanation of our experience of morality. As for subjectivism, we argue that it makes moral disagreement unresolvable and in fact impossible, since all moral claims are merely preferences that only depend on each individual. Under subjectivism, there is no point to moral discussions, and there is no path to moral progress, individually or societally. Preferences change, cultures change, and under subjectivism, that change is neither better nor worse in any objective sense. It is just different. We find from our moral experience that it is hard to live consistently under a subjectivist framework. Therefore, we argued that morality does not boil down to mere preferences. We argue that the experience of how a rational person would treat moral disagreements is more similar to how we treat disagreements over objective facts than subjective preferences. Preferences are generally treated equally, while moral and factual claims are not. Second, we argue that the evidence of our moral experience that objective moral values exist is self-evident, and it would take an objection that is even more self-evident for us to doubt that experience that is equally strong. Just as it is rational for us to believe our experience of the physical world and about mathematical truths and logical truths corresponds to an objective reality about them, so too is it rational to believe our moral experience corresponds to an objective morality. Both evolution and moral disagreement were offered as evidence against this proposition. We believe that neither is sufficient to cause us to doubt our moral experience. Evolution can only explain how we arrived at our moral beliefs, but that alone does not mean that those beliefs are untrue. If evolution causes us to doubt our moral beliefs, then why not other beliefs that we hold as well? Disagreement doesn't show us that morality can't be objective, because just as disagreement about a scientific fact does not mean it is not objectively true, disagreement about morality doesn't show that there are no moral objective values. Our experience of objective moral values still stands despite these two challenges. And third, we argue that the patterns of broad universal moral agreement are better explained on the theory of objective morality rather than subjective morality. The evidence and arguments we have presented convinces that objective morality does exist, and that it is a better explanation for our experience than subjectivism. And we find this to be true whether or not we believe that God exists. Although we do believe that God is the best explanation of how morality exists, that it does exist can be established without appealing to God. We would like to thank Ethan and Matt for their participation with us tonight in this debate and being willing to do this event and to have this discussion with us. We hope that both sides' arguments have perhaps caused you to deeply consider your own views and to better understand the evidence and to think more clearly and to consider what you might think on the subject of morality. So thank you for participating in this debate, and we've enjoyed it.
You guys have the rest of our time.
Alright, so on to the subjective side closing statements, and you have 8 minutes beginning now.
Sure. So I want to just recap 3 main points that have been consistently appearing throughout this debate. The first one I want to address is probably the most essential for us going forward and making progress in our understandings, which is the idea of a default position or a null hypothesis. In science, we assume the null hypothesis, which is that a relationship does not exist. This is something that we cannot prove. It's just assumed by default, and then you have to find evidence that overcomes the burden of proof that allows you to reject the null hypothesis. We propose that because there is no relationship between morality and existence, reality, subjective morality must be the null hypothesis, and therefore it is up to the objectivists to overcome the burden of proof in providing good reasons to believe objective morality. With that said, I want to address something that they brought up in their closing statement, which was regarding pain and suffering, and it was regarding the idea that certain preferences were built upon each other, or better than each other. I wouldn't phrase it as they're better than each other. I would phrase that they can go more and more fundamental. So the most fundamental desire is pain and suffering, and then all desires are built upon that. So when we talk about getting to the most foundational thing, we're talking about getting all desires back to their roots of pain and suffering. And then just to address one more point, throughout this debate, we constantly made note of the is-ought distinction, and we don't feel that our opponents made a good case for why objective ought statements can exist. They suggest that objective oughts sort of just exist out there without providing evidence for this. At this point, it seems like they're actually suggesting an is statement that they're sort of presenting as an ought statement. They're saying it is the case that there is a law out there that says you should not murder, you ought not murder. But this is an is statement. This is not an ought statement. They're relaying a command and telling us it's an ought statement, where I could just as easily ask, why ought I follow that command? And again, this is an infinite regress, which allows us to disregard objective oughts and therefore objective morality. I will note that while both Ethan and I disagree, it is possible that objective moral values exist.
Yes.
That said, because of the is-ought distinction, objective morality must be false. Now, I would like to invite the other side to come over to the subjectivist side, because even if objective moral values and duties exist, they can still come over to subjectivism and employ Kant's hypothetical imperative and still generate good reasons to follow what is good or what is bad. They may not be objective, but they're as close as you can get in reality. Now I'd like to turn over the conversation to Ethan for any final words that he has to say.
The only reason you should do something that exists is because it's in line with coming closer to your desires. That's all I have to say.
Alright, thank you. That concludes our formal debate portion. We will now open it up to audience Q&A. Zach and I will be asking the questions from those who join us online. People in the room may raise their hand and we will call on you to ask your question. Debate participants, if you could concisely restate the question that is asked, so everyone online can hear the question, that would be much appreciated.
I just need to write it down just real quick. You can start with the questions then.
Sure. All right, so let's start with people who are here. If you have any questions that you would like to ask, now is the time. Sure, Ben.
Hey guys, I'm been down in the basement. So you argued throughout the debate. It seemed at first I appreciate the work that you guys put into this. Awesome job. But it seemed throughout the debate that you relied on evolutionary theory as the best explanation or the best evidence for why subjectivism arose. Is it possible, given that it appears your argument relies on almost entirely on the actuality of evolutionary biological development, if evolution were to be false, could subjectivism be true?
I'm not going to be able to restate the entire question, but essentially, it is stated that our argument hinges heavily or almost entirely upon the truth of evolution, and if evolution is false, I assume you meant to say, is it possible that objectivism could be true? Is that?
No, it's subjectivism.
No, my
Oh,
question
yeah,
is,
I understood.
If
I understand.
evolution were to be false, could subjectivism be true?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine a world that didn't result due to evolution. I'll let you take the reins on this one.
Yeah, so there are two portions to this. One, I would say that there is no possible world in which subjectivism is false. How can I make that assertion? Because of the is-ought distinction. Now, by stating evolution, we're providing examples of how our subjective feelings might come to exist, right? So it's the development of our subjective feelings. It isn't proof for subjective morality, like as a concept, but rather our specific subjective morality. Does that answer your question?
Not really,
Okay.
but I don't want to take
No.
too much time to.
I would add in, there's a distinction here I'm trying to articulate. Subjectivism isn't true because evolution. Subjectivism is true because there is no empirical evidence in favor of objective moral properties that exist in the universe independent of the person's mind.
Further, sorry, just to add one more thing onto that. It is true because it is logically required. At least given our opponent's original definition that either objectivism or subjectivism is true, we can say that because of the is-ought distinction, objectivism is false. If we lay this out logically, it's A or B, and not A and not A and B. And so if we say that it's not objectivism, and it can't be neither, I guess, right? Is that how it has to be subjectivism. And then we're providing evolution and all of these other examples of how we get to the current moral feelings we have now.
Well, it would have been not A or B, and not
Yeah.
A and B, and, yeah. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but
Any further questions from people here?
logically required, that's.
Yeah, I'll ask a question. This is again for the subjectivist view. I kind of want to get at, the importance of solving the is-ought problem when making a case for objective truth. If 2 plus 2 is equal to 4 is objective, it is objective despite the fact that it cannot be compelled. Could objective morality similarly exist despite the fact it cannot be compelled?
I don't quite understand what you mean by 2 plus 2 equals 4 could not be compelled. That is a descriptive statement.
Right. Do you agree that objectively true that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4?
Yes. Well, it's.
It's
Go.
objectively true within the fictionalist framework that we accept
The-
of mathematics.
The short answer is yes.
In other words, if mathematics works the way we think it works, or, yeah, if mathematics works as the way we accept it to work, then 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Okay.
So
And
then,
you also agree that you cannot compel me to accord with that fact.
What do you mean by accord with that fact? You
Like,
mean
if
recognize it?
someone asked me, what is 2 plus 2 equal, you can't compel me to say 4. I could choose to say 5, but I would be objectively wrong.
You would be objectively wrong over a descriptive truth.
yes, given the definition of mathematics that we're operating under, that would be objectively false, yes.
So,
So
So
to
if
extend,
you're-
yeah, to extend to the second part of your question. So if we were to grant that objective moral values existed, like as some property of an action, you could be right or wrong about whether an action is objectively good or objectively bad, but this says nothing as to why you should do what is good or why you should not do what is bad.
Can I comment on that? I would just know that I think that if you do that, you have shown at least that if moral values exist, you've proven that a component of objective morality does exist. Might be a weird world where we're not obligated to do anything that is morally good or bad, but at least we have some objective standard of what is good and what is bad.
Yes, if objective moral values exist, if objective moral properties exist, then objective moral properties exist.
Right.
This does not compel any sort of objective ethical system.
Yeah, but I think it still, we were trying to prove, is morality objective or subjective, and we've shown that they're, yeah, if they exist, and that's what we were arguing, weren't we?
Yeah, there's a distinction between proving the existence of objective moral properties and compelling some sort of objective ought, some sort of objectively true subscription to an ethical system.
Right.
Under subjectivism-
There's a distinction between the descriptive claim and the prescriptive claim,
Yeah,
right?
definitely.
And so, we might even admit that it is possible that you're completely right and that moral values exist. That still doesn't mean that morality exists, right?
Well,
Or objective morality.
I would think that the fact that there are moral value claims would be a component, or at least a sub topic of morality itself. There's moral value and there's moral duty, both are.
Sure, no, sure. To close this, I
Right.
would just say that the existence of objective properties does not create an objective ought, and that's the problem we have. The objective ought
Right.
is prescriptive. But
Sure, and the ought would be prescriptive. Yeah, but we just argue, I guess we would have the view that if we can prove that the objective value component, there is an objective standard out there that does exist, that we can at least measure our actions against, whether or not we are compelled to do them or not do them. If there's an objective standard, we say this action is better than this action, or this action is good and this action is bad, that still shows that there's an objective moral standard that we can at least appeal to if we're not, even if we're not compelled to do that.
yeah,
Yes, sure, yeah.
Thank you, guys.
All right, any more questions for the people present?
I got a question for the subjectivist, but I feel bad everybody's directing their questions to them. Is there
We
anyone
love the
online
attention.
Yeah.
who's directing their questions to the objectivist?
no, give them all to us. We want the attention.
No. There are no objective questions online, so. Okay.
Go ahead.
If I understand you guys correctly, it seems like you said said several times tonight something that sounds, if I could put it into the history of philosophy, very much like a logical positivist, like the early analytic philosophers in the 1900s, the early 1900s. They would propose, like A.J. Ayer and so forth, would put forth what they call the verification principle, that they would only believe things that could be empirically tested or that can be empirically verified. And if you're putting forward that verificationist claim of the logical positivist, then I would ask this follow-up question, and that is, what empirical evidence would you or could you provide for the is-ought problem? How could you empirically verify that?
Oh, the existence of the is-ought problem, you mean? Sorry?
Or just to believe, what is your empirical evidence, or
Sure.
your way to empirically verify that the is-ought problem is true?
If you want me to jump in, I can.
Well, do we need to restate that? Just
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So the question, if I'm getting it correctly, is can we provide evidence for the existence of the is-ought distinction?
The existence or just empirically verify it.
Right.
So like Joel brought up some things that can't be empirically verified, but we most all believe them. Like the assumption that we should trust our senses, some other properly basic thing, according to the objectivist position. One of those was believing in objective morality. Maybe we can't empirically verify that, but it's similar to other properly basic beliefs.
Yeah.
So if you are affirming like a logical positivist type of empirical verification, that you're only going to believe things that can be empirically tested and verified, how can you empirically test or verify the is-ought problem?
So I don't want to say that I'm not affirming logical positivism because I'm not super well read on it. What I will say is that perhaps this will provide an answer to your question. I tend to fall into the category so there are the foundationalists and the coherentists, correct? And so I would consider myself a coherentist. And so for me to believe a belief, it just has to form with all of my other beliefs. And within that, I find that there is a distinction between is statements and ought statements. Insofar as ought statements cannot exist mutually with is statements, and given that we have good reason to believe is statements exist, given that we make is statements, and about things that we observe, right? The ought statements are they logically cannot follow, and then we have to discount them, at least objectively.
I would sort of say that I think this sort of distinction intuitively is kind of like the distinction between making a statement of fact and sort of shouting some sort of expression that isn't a true grammatically correct English sentence, but it's still, as opposed to making a statement of fact, is meant to be a way of reasoning or compelling. And I think that's pretty much the difference. I mean, on a certain level, words are just meaningless sounds that come out of our mouths that we contextually understand. And I think that contextually, there is a difference between making a statement of fact and giving somebody reasoning to do something. And I think that the reasoning part is the part that must be subjective. But
So it sounds like both of you are saying that you are willing to believe certain things that can't be empirically tested. Are you open to believing in things that can't be empirically tested?
certain things can't be empirically tested. We have foundations that have to be assumed.
Well, it depends what you mean by assumed, right? So we have foundations that we assume. We don't necessarily assume that they're true. At least I don't. So I don't assume anything with 100% certainty, but I base my worldview off of I base my worldview off of experiences and what experiences allow for us to build a non-logically contradictory worldview. It's a little hard to articulate, sort of because I'm only developing this theory, starting this semester, so perhaps I'll have a more comprehensive answer in the future, but I guess I would resort to saying that as long as it's not logically contradictory, and we experience it, we will be open to believing it.
I will say that I thought you guys, all four of you, did an excellent job tonight and handled yourself very respectfully and treated one another very respectfully. And I'll say for the subjectivist side, you guys helped me tonight understand subjectivism better.
Yeah, I'd second that, yeah. That's probably the main thing I got away from anything. So I like hearing things directly from people instead of people who don't hold the position explain how, I don't know if that makes sense, but like, yeah, it's really refreshing to me to hear it directly from people, not to be in such a bubble. I think that can be dangerous to thinking, so yeah, I appreciated that a lot, for sure.
We do have a few questions online. They're all directed to the subjective side.
Fun times.
Let's do this one, and this is toward Matt.
Yep.
On subjectivism, why is diminishing of pain and human flourishing worthy desires, or why should those be worthy desires? If subjectivism is true, is not your argument only persuasive to those who are already subjectivists?
Well, perhaps, sure. But like, I'm trying to convince people of subjectivism, I guess. So, I have perhaps a little bit. So it's a really good question. I have a slight issue with the wording of worthy. I don't think that desires are more worthy than another. I think they can be more foundational than another. So, for example, my desire to avoid eating Brussels sprouts is based off of my desire to avoid the suffering of the bad tastes that I'm going to experience when I eat Brussels sprouts. Now, I actually happen to love eating Brussels sprouts, but it's a good example. I would change it from worthy to most foundational, and then I think perhaps the issue goes away because we're appealing to the most foundational universal desires. And Ethan and I would both say that if something is living, or at least if something is sentient, then it necessarily experiences pain and suffering as the most foundational desires.
Maybe this makes sense, or maybe doesn't. Where would that foundational desire come from then, and why is it foundational to universally?
Well, where does pain and suffering? Just make sure I'm understanding you correctly.
Well, yeah, just like you're building off of like an initial foundational desire, and that's pain and suffering. But like why is that universal with every single person? And isn't there some people that they're warped into thinking they like pain, physical pain, they're like people's like brains malfunction and whatnot. So more of a clarifying than anything else. I'm not trying to make a point really, but
No. I would say that for the people, we were actually talking about this before coming over, and we talked about hypothetical aliens or different creatures that we could communicate with that had different standards of pleasure and pain. We ultimately would argue that the pleasure and pain is translatable, even if not directly equivalent for every person. What is pleasurable to one person might vary from what is pleasurable to another person, but they both have states that they prefer, and they both have states that they seek to avoid, and that's what we mean by pleasure and pain. And that's why we think it's the most foundational, because there's fundamentally things that we want and things that we seek to avoid.
Yeah.
But
Are you saying it's foundational that pleasure and pain are things that people or beings experience, or are you saying it's foundational that beings have certain experiences of pleasure and pain that they hold in common?
I'm saying that of all the desires that people have, the most deeply rooted, the seed of all of the complex desires between eating a dessert with more sugar or anything like that, the deepest, the most foundational desire, the first desire from which all others stem from, is the desire to seek pleasurable states and avoid unpleasurable states. And what pleasurable and unpleasurable is completely subjective to that person. But it is still a matter of fact that there are states that they go toward and states that they avoid.
Right. I guess I was just saying, but do you argue that there's any kind of convergence there? Like, well, it's common that a lot of human beings would not want to murder because that generally causes pain. Would there be kind of a generalizability there, or is it just that at base, some psychopath might think it brings him pleasure to murder people, and
Sure.
Generally, we have empathy, just So that allows us to sort of, it's a sort of deterrent because we don't want others to experience pain. But also, even if we didn't care about others experiencing pain, because being in a society is better for me, where I have to agree to not cause pain to other people, and they also have to agree to not cause pain to me. I can see how even if I did want to cause pain to people, because being in society is preferential to that, it's better for everyone to sacrifice the sort of wanting to cause pain to others, or sort of throw away their disregard of another person's pain. It sort of
In
forces
other
you to
words,
care.
it increases pleasure more to live in a society that follows certain rules, rather than to go for a temporary amount of pleasure of, say, murdering someone, right? You will increase your pleasure more by living in the society that doesn't murder.
But would it increase your pleasure more, or like pleasure generally? Because
Well-
I'm making the comment that everybody's pleasure would be
If it didn't increase your pleasure more, you'd probably end up a murderer.
and
But then you would
there'd
go
be
in
nothing-
jail, and most people, people tend to dislike the idea of jail, and so they don't do murder.
More so than
Right.
they like
But if
the
I
idea of
didn't,
murder.
there'd be nothing wrong with it. I guess.
Theoretically.
Well,
And that's how we argue like all the balances are made.
Yeah,
It's
you're
always a calculation of which is going to be better than the other. And that can be a difference between some goodness in a bad thing, or two bad things, which one is the least bad, or and by bad I
You.
mean preferable. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yes.
and it all comes down to, well, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do because I'm going to find it good for me, bad for me, something I like doing, something I don't like doing, and then that's
It seems like you have good reason to do the things you want to do.
good reasons that are purely subjective.
Sure. So Ethan and I are, I don't want to speak for Ethan, but at least I am a psychological egoist, which means I think that people can only do things that are that conform with their desires. In other words, for someone to do any action consciously, the pros of that action have to outweigh the cons. And so
Yeah.
if we were to do a pro-con list for things like murdering, well, for some psychopath, right, the pro of murder might be the enjoyment that they get, but the cons that most people tend to follow and why they don't murder, right, is because they would they would go to jail or any other of these negative consequences that they don't want. And so it's there's an equation there, right? But laws
Yeah.
balance the equation in society's favor.
Yeah, but purely arbitrarily, because we decided to do that.
Well, not arbitrarily
Do
necessarily.
you really want to just these for the
Yes.
last 2 minutes?
Yeah, okay,
if you don't
the
mind,
next question,
yes.
okay.
Sure, and let's make this the last question. On what basis can you say one is accountable for one's own desires? Accountability presupposes an ought.
People can choose to not do the things that they desire to do, sure, but it's not going to end up being the case most of the time.
Well, I would even say that they can't choose what they don't desire to do. Again, going back to the psychological egoism, right, just to make this point clear, if someone chooses to do something that is against a desire they say they have, they're actually just expressing they have a more foundational desire against doing that thing. So people can have unconscious desires that control their actions, in other words.
I mean, to be extremely, very clear on this matter, we would always end up phrasing something as a matter of fact. We don't actually think that true prescriptive statements exist at all.
Right.
So,
There's utility in phrasing things in a way that makes sense,
Yeah.
Given the current state of our language.
there's a utility in using prescriptive language, but we think that all prescriptive language is actually
Subjective.
belying a descriptive truth.
Yes.
Could it be an objective moral truth that I should follow my own desires? Maybe that is like the one objective
I
moral
would
truth
I would connect that to rationality. I would say that if we're going to define anything as rational, what do you have good reason to do? You have reason to do things that are going to be the most successful. Well, most successful in what? Well, that's really up to you, right? But if you have a goal, I think that's as objective as you can get. You have a goal. If you want this thing, then there is a better way to do it, and there is a worse way to do it. In the sense that one will more effectively or more so get you to the goal than the other one will, and that's the most objective you can get.
All right, and it's 9:30. That's officially the end of the debate. If you want to stay around and talk afterwards with the debaters, I'm sure they'd be happy to do so. But for the moment, let's just give them all a round of applause for the good job they did tonight.